Alright, tubes. It's Thursday night at a Dirt Bike 5100 ranch, and that means it's Goofy Project night. So, now before I get too into this, I just want to mention this is kind of a highly experimental project I'm doing here. So, I don't really recommend anybody trying to recreate what I do here, just due to the fact that I have no idea whether it's going to work, and whether or not it does work. There's a lot of factors that could go into it being successful or unsuccessful. So, I don't recommend trying to try this or do what I'm doing, because if you screw it up, it could really cause some serious damage to your engine. So just wanted to throw that out there. So here's the deal. You all remember our timing chain incident and the startup rattle. And to make a long story short, though I replaced the tensioners, I still have a startup rattle. And the way the tensioners work, if you haven't already seen the tensioner video, is that it's a hydraulic tensioner that's also spring loaded. And the idea is that a spring-loaded tensioner will keep tension on the timing chains for the brief period of time when you start the engine that there is no oil pressure. However, apparently the spring is not weak enough, or the engine has worn enough that the tensioner just doesn't work when there's no oil pressure. And so what I've done here is I've devised an automatic oiling system here. I tried to keep the drawing very simple, but I'll try and explain it as thoroughly as I can. What you have here is, this is the engine over here, and your oil pan is right here where this little T-shape here is. So normally that would just be your drain bolt right in there, but what I'm going to do is I have an adapter. It's actually right over here. It's already hooked up to the T-thread. I have this adapter here that goes from the thread on my oil drain bolt to 1/8 inch pipe thread. So that T is going to sit in here. And as you can see, one side has a cap on it for changing the oil, and then the other side has a hose barb. So the hose barb will be attached to a hose, just a standard transmission core line, good for high enough pressure rating that I won't have a problem here. And that'll run to this pump here. Now this is just a utility pump that will definitely get the job done for what I'm trying to do. Then it'll run through a check valve. I have a check valve here. The smallest I was able to get at my local hardware supply was 1/2 inch, so I went with 1/2 inch instead of 3/8, and just got a reducer. So that'll reduce down, and then the check valve, my drawing is actually kind of backwards with the way the flow of the pump is, but the check valve will go on here and prevent oil from flowing backwards. Backwards meaning in this direction. So the pump will take oil from the oil pan, through the pump, through the check valve, and then it'll go up into here. Now this right here on the side of the engine is your oil filter, and what I've gone and purchased is this thing here, and some of you race car guys might be familiar with these. This here is a sandwich adapter, and as its name suggests, basically what you do with this thing is you sandwich it between the block and where your oil filter would go. So this will go up tight against the block. You'll screw this on where the threads for the oil filter are, and then you'll screw your oil filter onto that. Now what a lot of people use these things for is for a temperature sender unit for oil temp, or a pressure sender unit for oil pressure. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to send oil in through this thing. So the way it'll flow is it'll flow into this thing. It will not flow backwards through the engine because of the geared oil pump. It shouldn't flow through that. So it'll go down through the oil filter, up into the engine. It'll flow through the engine, and of course eventually end up back in the oil pan. Now the reason for this is, again, as I stated, I'm trying to get rid of that startup rattle. So what I'll do is before I start the engine, I'll have a momentary switch, and I'll run the pump until I get oil pressure on my oil pressure gauge. And then hopefully I'll be able to start the engine at that time and get no startup rattle, and therefore have no additional wear to the timing chain guides, which at this point, not being the first owner, we're close to the first owner of this truck, there's no telling what kind of condition they're in at 140,000 miles. But anyhow, so I'll just show you guys before I get my hands all dirty again. You can see that I put the T-fitting in on the oil pan there, and that worked out pretty well. I got to get a hose clamp that actually fits, but that's going to be later. This is just the run through to make sure this actually is going to work. And you can see up there where the oil filter goes, and my next step now will be to put the sandwich adapter on and hook the hose up there. So I'll get that on there. I'll show you before I put the filter on with the hose hooked up, and then I'll be screwing that on. And at that point, I'll be ready to hook a power supply up and see if it actually builds us up some oil pressure. So stand by here. Alright tubes, time for an update here. We got pumps everywhere. You guys missed a lot, let me tell you. I came to find out that this pump here has a bad impeller in it. It is only a Harbor Freight pump, so you know, it's not like I expected that it was going to be a top of the line aircraft piece of machinery. But anyhow, so that's no good. I just brought out this old hydraulic pump I had just to mess around, but that thing's gigantic. I can't have that thing under my hood. But what I actually did is my dad came across this other pump here, and I just got the motor here. I have the pump head off at the moment, sitting over here. The one thing I don't like about it is it's got a plastic housing, but that doesn't really matter too much to me anyway, because what I'm actually going to do is that's a 120 volt pump there, so I can't have that all the time anyway. But I'm going to mount it up and run the 120 volt off an inverter just to test it out and see if it works and if it's worth my time. And if it is, then I'm going to go ahead and order a new impeller for this, and not a Harbor Freight one. I'm going to order a good one off a higher quality pump, and then hopefully I'll end up with something a little higher performance there. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get the other pump mounted up, and then we're going to test it out, see if it works. Well, alrighty now, it's been a little while since I did an update, and believe it or not, we're actually looking at a finished product now. As you can see, I ended up going with the larger pump, the hydraulic pump that I originally wasn't planning on using due to its size. And actually, to make room for it, as you can see, I took out my cruise control module, because that used to sit right in here, but I figured we don't need that. I don't really use cruise control anyway. I also went with a copper line on the high pressure side as opposed to the transmission core line, the rubber hose. Two reasons being, the first, that I didn't want it to burst as I was going down the road, whether it ruptured on something, it hit the exhaust, or just couldn't take the pressure, or I was a little bit worried about getting leaks at the hose barb fittings, because if you recall before, there was a hose barb on here, and the hose slid over that, and then we had a hose clamp on there. You know, that's something, even if it's leaking a drip at a time, you don't want that, because then you got all kinds of oil all over your driveway and inside your truck, and you don't want that. So that's one thing that I did. There's just some brass ferrules in there. I didn't go with flare fittings, and it seems to be holding up quite well. No leaks at all. We have here our line coming up from the oil pan. So this is our low pressure side. Runs out of the pump. There's an integral check valve inside the pump, so I was able to get rid of that big hunkin' check valve that I had before. So that was good. And then of course our line runs down, and you could probably see it pretty well without me getting under the truck. You can see the line runs right down there to the sandwich adapter. That white thing down there is a Motorcraft oil filter. So that's that. Let me also show you the wiring. I'll show you what I did on that real quick, and then we'll get inside the truck and show you how it works. The electrical system for the pump is pretty simple. I have this auxiliary power panel that I fabricated a while ago, and what we have is a circuit breaker here. So we have power coming in from the battery, running through the circuit breaker, and then one leg goes off to my other accessories, and that's a whole other video. But then the other leg comes off here and runs down to this solenoid. Now the solenoid is what actually turns the pump on and off, because the pump draws quite a bit of current when it's operating, more than I would trust through a normal automotive relay. So that's why we went with the big solenoid. And the nice thing about this one is that it actually grounds through the chassis, and so all you have to do is put 12 volts to the solenoid to energize it. Now inside the truck I have my auxiliary switch panel that I wired up last summer, and I chose to use this momentary push button switch to turn the pre-oiler on and off as opposed to a switch, because you wouldn't want something like that to get switched on and left on. That could cause some problems. So I just went with the momentary button. So if you press this button, the oil pump runs, and that's pretty much all there is to it. This is going to be a test of our pre-oiler system, As you can see, the engine is cold. It's probably been about 14 hours since I had the truck running last. It sat overnight. It's not particularly cold out. It's about 30, actually it's about 50 degrees out. So it's not too cold. The oil's not that thick. But either way, for our startup sequence, what I do is I turn the ignition on. We have our pre-oiler button down here, and I'll start pre-oiling, and momentarily you'll see we get pressure. Pressure is up. I start the engine, push the clutch in, and we get no rattle at all. Nothing. Totally silent. So there you go. It works good.